All right, folks. I'm back making some videos. Sorry about the couple-week hiatus that I took, but between my regular teaching responsibilities and doing these on the side, got a little burnt out, so I decided to give myself a little break, but now I shall be back making some more videos for a while. I'd like to start out by continuing what I started a few weeks ago, the discussion on the autonomic nervous system. In the first video, I primarily discussed the anatomic differences and some basic functional differences between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And now today I want to dive a little more specifically into the physiologic differences between these two systems and how they affect the overall functionality of the body. All right, so that's what we're going to do today. But before we do so, I just want to even though there's another video on this, I just like to provide a brief overview and review, just to kind of cue up and tie into the main points that we're going to be going over today. So that's what the first part of the discussion will evolve around, is just some review. And then I'd like to discuss the major neurotransmitters that are secreted by both the divisions of the autonomic nervous system and the receptors that these neurotransmitters work with and bind to. And then as a result, by understanding the actions of these two, you can understand the physiologic actions that occur when the neurotransmitters and the receptors interact with one another. All right, and then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the adrenal medulla, because that has some specific application to some items we're going to be talking about. And plus, this will also, when you get to the endocrine system, we'll also come back to this, because you'll learn about the adrenal gland, and you get the, this will be kind of a good way to just give you a foot in the door into that system. And then these last couple I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about, but I'm just going to briefly mention them. Especially with the ANS control, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, just because there are specific topics that we'll be hitting along this line in other discussions down the road. So like I said, I don't really feel the need to go in a lot of depth with this area, because we'll like I said, we'll hit it as we go. And then plus also, once I start getting more into the central nervous system and talking about the brain, a lot of this is going to come back as well. All right. And then pharmacology, I'm not a pharmacist, but there are some very basic pharmacology applications that go with that go with a good solid understanding of the autonomic nervous system and the actions of this system at this level. All right, so so we'll talk a little bit about again how pharmacology can apply to the system. All right, so this is these are the main points I want to cover throughout this discussion. And on that note, let's get the ball rolling. So again, there's just some basic terminology that goes with this system that you have to make sure you're acquainted with. Remember, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic, you should think automatic. Okay. And that there are two major divisions of the autonomic nervous system, called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, often abbreviated SNS and PSNS. All right. And remember, there are some differences between this and what we like to call the somatic nervous system. And again, I'll review the anatomic differences here in a second. Okay, but remember, when you think the somatic division of the nervous system, you think more voluntary. Okay, whereas the autonomic nervous system, you think more automatic. Okay, or involuntary. Okay, so then this should just be a little review 101 of some basic histology and some other discussions that we've already had. When you think of voluntary control, you're going to think skeletal muscles. Okay, you're going to think skeletal muscles, some tissues in the body that you have direct conscious control of. All right, whereas with the autonomic nervous system, what areas here, are automatically controlled, essentially pretty much everything else. You're thinking, cardiac muscle, the heart. You're going to think smooth muscle, glandular activity, cellular activity, within fat cells and so on. All right. So essentially, a good way to think of the autonomic nervous system primarily is this is a system that innervates cardiac and smooth muscle, whereas the somatic division of the nervous system innervates skeletal muscle. Okay, skeletal muscle. And also, I guess I should, lump glands in here as well. All right, so the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And remember, in the previous video, we started to mention this. Again, there's some basic conceptual differences, but we're going to get into the physiologic differences here, and anatomic, I should say, as well. But remember, in general, we said that the sympathetic nervous system more or less speeds up or increases your physiologic activity, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system slows you down. So, this is like punching the gas. This is like punching the brakes. All right, and so essentially you can think of the sympathetic nervous system as a division of the nervous system that mobilizes the body for stress. All right, so there are two major situations in which we would want to mobilize this system. Basically, exercise. When you're putting a lot of physiologic stress on your system, and you need to make the right adjustments to keep up with this stress. Or if you're in a heightened state, you're a heightened state of stress. And you guys have probably heard of the, if you've taken psychology prior to this, you've heard of the fight or flight response. That's a sympathetic nervous system that activates this, all right, based on, again, extreme stress, all right? Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, that has the, you should think of these two systems as, even though, we need both of them, they more or less antagonize one another. And which is why I believe that the autonomic nervous system is probably the easiest part of the nervous system to understand, just because if you really have a good solid understanding of one of these divisions, you more or less just have to think in the opposite direction. So if we say the sympathetic nervous system physiologically mobilizes the body for stress, the parasympathetic nervous system helps to recover from stress, okay, such as decreasing heart rate, breath rate, making the right metabolic changes, and so on. All right, so bear in mind that there are these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. All right, an adrenergic and cholinergic. Okay, adrenergic and cholinergic. Okay, you're going to want to think of adrenergic as being associated with the sympathetic nervous system, and cholinergic as being associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, because this word, I think it's easy to make this association just because, you think adrenergic, you're going to think adrenaline. All right, because they sound kind of similar. And when you think adrenaline, you all know what adrenaline does. You've all heard that word since you were little kids and known that adrenaline puts you in a heightened state, okay? And we'll talk more in depth about these in a second. Or not in a second, but a little while farther down the road in this presentation. But just keep these in mind and keep these associations in mind for now. All right? And then the varicosities. Okay, the varicosities, basically I wanted to bring this up because essentially this is a little difference between autonomic neurons. Another difference between autonomic neurons and somatic neurons is that when you look at, let's say this is a somatic motor neuron and it's innervating a skeletal muscle, you're going to see you're going to see the cell body, you're going to see this long axon, and see these synaptic terminals at the end of this neuron. All right, and then within these synaptic terminals are neurotransmitters that will be released upon, action potentials and certain stimulation, and then they'll carry out their effect on the target tissue. Whereas when you're looking at autonomic neurons, whether it's parasympathetic or sympathetic, all right, now more specifically the postganglionic neurons, all right, when the axons start to reach the tissues, what's going to happen is they're going to start to form these bulbous-like structures within the tissues. Okay, and again, sympathetic and parasympathetic both do these, or both form these. Okay. And within these varicosities, again, neurotransmitters are stored, okay? But again, you can see the anatomic differences between the somatic and the autonomic neurons here. So that's all the varicosities are. And then they can form these diffuse networks within the tissues of these varicosities, all right? So keep that in mind, this terminology, because these are some terms you're just going to be seeing as we go, primarily these first few as we go, all right? So let's just briefly, we've already more or less hit on this, the functions, but let's briefly review the anatomic differences between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, again, just so you guys can have this fresh in your head. So the somatic nervous system, remember, we're talking one long motor neuron, okay, and so somatic. Okay, you're looking at one long motor neuron and the release of the neurotransmitter, ACH, which remember stands for acetylcholine, all right, and that's going to bind to nicotinic receptors, essentially on skeletal muscle, all right. So one long neuron, acetylcholine, and then skeletal muscle, all right. Now, when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, remember the ANS operates in a two-neuron system, whereas somatic neurons operate in essentially a one-neuron system. Okay, so when we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system, okay, when we're taking a look at the sympathetic nervous system here, all right, remember we've got a preganglionic neuron. All right, and then remember with the sympathetic nervous system, there are these paravertebral ganglion along the thoracolumbar regions of the vertebrae, okay, and that form, remember, that sympathetic chain that we discussed in the previous video. All right, so these short what we call preganglionic neurons, all right, enter their way into those paravertebral ganglion, and then what they do is they'll synapse with a second neuron. And these second neurons, or what we call postganglionic neurons, are much longer. Okay, so this would be preganglionic. This would be postganglionic. All right? And remember that in a kind of a rule of thumb that I told you guys to remember in the previous video, that whether we're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic neurons, the preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine, okay, acetylcholine, and those again bind to nicotinic receptors, all right, and remember that the actions of acetylcholine between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons is always excitatory. Okay, this is always excitatory. Now, that's only between the pre and postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. This is going to be different in a second, in which you're going to see. All right, and then this postganglionic sympathetic neuron will branch out to various tissues, and then basically will release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which will then bind to various receptors such as alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, beta-2 receptors. And we'll talk more specifically about these in a little bit and the effects that they have. And remember, we're talking smooth muscle, and glands. All right. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, though. I mean, this will remain the same, okay? Preganglionic neuron, nicotinic receptor, excitatory, acetylcholine. Okay, but there are some there are some aspects of the sympathetic nervous system in which acetylcholine is released on the postganglionic neuron, and these bind to muscarinic receptors, okay, and sweat glands. Okay, and we'll remember this because we're gonna. Sorry, the marker's going crazy here. All right, and remember this because we're gonna come back to this in a little while here. All right, so remember the actions with acetylcholine and nicotinic receptors at the between the pre and postganglionic neurons is always excitatory. All right, and then the actions are different. And then now you'll notice that different neurotransmitters are released here. All right, so basically you want to think that in almost all postganglionic sympathetic neurons release norepinephrine. All right, and then this is going to bind to one of these 4 subtypes of receptors, essentially. All right, and you're going to think, like I said, based on what we just discussed, that the sympathetic nervous system, more or less, is going to have excitatory effects. So how we achieve those excitatory effects are going to vary based on the receptor subtype, i.e. the chemical makeup of them. All right. So then, if we're going to take a look at the parasympathetic nervous system, supposed to be an S. All right, parasympathetic nervous system. This is a little different. We're talking long preganglionic neurons. Okay, and again, acetylcholine. All right, acetylcholine, nicotinic receptors. And remember, what did we say occurs between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons when acetylcholine and nicotinic receptors meet up? Okay, we said that this is excitatory, okay? And then the postganglionic neurons are a lot shorter, all right? And these release acetylcholine as well, and these bind to, again, the muscarinic receptors. And, you know, again, we're talking that these postganglionic neurons, so we'll go post, are innervating, okay, are innervating smooth muscle. Oops. Sorry about that, folks. And glands as well. Smooth muscle and glands. So both of these innervate smooth muscle and glands, sympathetic and parasympathetic. But now, what are you seeing here? You're seeing different, you know, at the postganglionic neurons, you're seeing different neurotransmitters being released, and you should start to think there's probably going to be some different effects here. All right, so essentially what you should be thinking right now is that norepinephrine is going to increase the activity in these tissues that are innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, and simultaneously acetylcholine is going to decrease the activity in these areas. Okay, so and we'll get some specific examples here in a little while, but that's something you need to be thinking about. All right, that's something you need to be thinking about. All right, and you know, which kind of brings me to discuss a concept here called dual innervation. Okay, now I brought this up in the last video, but I want to, you know, I want to repeat this again just because it is extremely important. All right, you know, the concept of dual innervation, you know, this picture and you know, this picture should hopefully, you know, give you an idea of what this means. We're saying here that almost that organs, you know, these areas of smooth muscle and glands are innervated by the SNS and parasympathetic nervous system, all right, the PSNS. All right, so for example, you know, we could think about the heart. Okay, we could think about the heart. All right, so what we're saying here is that there are sympathetic neurons that innervate the heart, and there are parasympathetic neurons that innervate the heart. Okay, so both of these sets of neurons, okay, I'm not obviously in these exact locations, but I'm just, you know, using this picture to prove a point. All right. So what we're saying here then is, now remember, these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system have antagonizing effects on one another. The sympathetic nervous system increases activity essentially, parasympathetic decreases, all right? So basically what you should be thinking right now then is one of these systems, you know, depending on the situations, is going to be more in control than the other. Okay, now let me ask you this right now. As you're watching this video, okay, as you're listening to this, as you're sitting in your chair, you know, listening to this in your computer, which one of these two divisions do you think is more active or is more dominant on the activity of the heart? The parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous system? Which one do you think it would be? I mean, think about your heart rate right now. What is your resting heart rate? Where are you at? You should be at around 70 to 80 to hopefully not much higher than 85 beats per minute while at rest. All right, so your heart rate is not really all that high. It's at a resting pace, okay? So remember, we said that the parasympathetic nervous system slows the body down. So right now, you have what's in increased tone, as they like to say. I'll talk about tone in a little while. So basically what we're saying here is there's more parasympathetic activity. All right, and remember that the bulk of the parasympathetic nervous system is the vagus nerve. So you would say that there is what's called vagal tone, okay, on the heart right now. So your vagus nerve is essentially keeping the pacemaker of your heart down to a relatively slow, nice and normal pace, okay, because you don't need your heart at a rate of 120 beats per minute if you're not really being that physiologically active. All right. So then so then understanding this basic concept, then it's easy to understand then how these systems work, because if you increase activity, you know that your heart rate's got to go up. Okay, you know that your heart rate has to go up. So if you're in a situation of high stress, like I said, exercise, someone cuts you off driving down the highway, you run into a bear in the middle of the woods, whatever it may be, all right, you know that the sympathetic nervous system is going to basically take over in this situation. All right, so then this should get you thinking then in what controls these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and I'll come to that later, but think about that. All right, and last but not least, I wanted to mention kind of the special innervation of the adrenal medulla. All right, just because the adrenal medulla is quite important to this system as well. So if we look at, I'm just going to abbreviate this, adrenal medulla. All right, so what we'll see here is there really are no postganglionic neurons to this. Okay, but essentially these would be preganglionic sympathetic neurons, all right? And like any other preganglionic neuron, these nerves that go into the adrenal medulla are going to release acetylcholine, which are going to bind to nicotinic receptors. Let's abbreviate this again, adrenal medulla. All right, and what this is going to do is that's going to stimulate the release of epinephrine, and norepinephrine into our bloodstream. And about 80% is going to be epinephrine, and the remaining 20% of hormones from the adrenal medulla are going to be norepinephrine. All right. Now, these two hormones are what we call catecholamines. Sorry about the marker hiccups. Okay, catecholamines, all right, i.e. the high-class term for adrenaline. Boy, this thing's driving me nuts. Adrenaline, okay? So you know what adrenaline does. We've all experienced it at some point in time. Adrenaline essentially, puts your body into a physiologic heightened state. Really high heart rate. Your breath rate is really high. Your pupils are dilated like crazy, okay? You get the picture. All right, and understanding this basic concept will help you understand something that we're going to start discussing in a little while, and I'm going to come back to when we get to the endocrine system with a little more depth, the fight or flight response, okay, the fight or flight response. All right, now think about the name, adrenal, okay, epinephrine, norepinephrine, okay, the adrenal gland, adrenal. What does reno mean in medical terminology? You know that that's kidney. Okay, that's kidney. Okay, remember, epinephrine. Another word for kidney. You guys know that epi means above. Okay, around. All right, so essentially, these hormones, all right, you can think of, epinephrine, norepinephrine, you're thinking of the adrenal. So what should that tell you about the anatomic location of the kidney, or kidneys, of the adrenal glands? The adrenal glands are on the superior aspect of the kidney. So here's a kidney, the adrenal glands are going to be right there. All right, and then these preganglionic sympathetic neurons will innervate the adrenal gland just superior to the kidneys. Okay, so keep this in mind. All right, that these, these basic anatomic and chemical differences between, between the between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and also between the somatic divisions or the somatic motor divisions of the nervous system and the automatic nervous system. All right. So keep that in mind. This is important to understand, not just for the physiologic, concepts we're going to be discussing shortly, but also for the pharmacologic as well. All right. So going back to this, terminology 101 real quick. Now, so we would say, wherever acetylcholine is released, we would say that's cholinergic. All right. So then where neurotransmitter is going to be released, we would say that's adrenergic. Okay, adrenergic. Okay, so basically, now this is kind of an exception to this rule, because remember we said, the parasympathetic nervous system essentially slows down activity. All right, but remember this is a completely different division of the nervous system, and even though these nicotonic receptor, you see nicotonic receptor, acetylcholine, there are some slight differences between these receptors. So yes, they do receive the same chemical messages, but they do elicit slightly different responses. Okay, slightly different responses, because remember, well, actually not necessarily, because excitatory. I'm confusing this with muscarinic. All right. Okay. So sorry about that. Just omit what I just said. Sorry. All right. So excitatory, and then acetylcholine and muscarinic, inhibitory. Okay. Hope I didn't confuse you all too much there. Sorry, my mouth works faster than my mind sometimes. Okay, so again, we've already mentioned the neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system, acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Okay, again, you're going to think acetylcholine at the preganglionic, okay, is always going to be excitatory. Okay, acetylcholine postganglionic is going to be inhibitory. Not inhibitory, but we'll just say slows down activity. Okay, and remember acetylcholine with the somatic nervous system. Okay, with the somatic nervous system. Okay, that's always going to be excitatory as well, because remember the nicotonic receptors. Okay, the nicotonic receptors. Remember that these inhibitory actions occur as a result of acetylcholine plus the muscarinic receptors, okay, a different type of receptor. All right, and remember norepinephrine, okay, norepinephrine is essentially going to be binding to the alpha and the various beta receptors, and again, that is always going to be excitatory. All right, with the exception here, as you can see, that this is technically a cholinergic action, acetylcholine on these receptors, except the difference here is that this is still going to be, excitatory, because this is going to increase, your rate of sweat. Okay, this is going to increase your perspiration rate. All right, here's rate of sweating. All right, so keep that in mind. So the neurotransmitters, I think we have that pretty much down. Pretty much down packed. All right, now I want to spend some time talking about the receptors of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, we've already started talking about these, the cholinergic and the adrenergic receptors. All right, so the cholinergic receptors, all right, again, remember that these are interacting with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, acetylcholine. And remember, you're going to find these nicotonic receptors in a few different areas. One, you're going to find them around... you're going to find them on the you're going to find these, not on you're going to, shoot, I said that incorrectly. You're going to find these receptors between the pre and postganglionic, so essentially on the postganglionic receptors, okay? And as a result, the action of acetylcholine and these nicotonic receptors, remember, is excitatory. And remember, acetylcholine plus these nicotonic receptors on skeletal muscle is also excitatory. All right. So essentially what nicotonic receptors are, these are ion pumps. Okay, these essentially are ion pumps. All right, so So basically, that are made up, I'm not going to go really into the molecular biology of these, but these are made up of various protein subunits, okay, and when acetylcholine, all right, when acetylcholine binds to these protein subunits, that'll create a conformational change, man, I can't talk today. It'll create a conformational change, which will essentially make this, make this gate open up. And what that does, that causes sodium to diffuse down its electrochemical gradient and potassium down its electrochemical gradient, i.e., sodium in, potassium out. And you can get and if you understand membrane potential, you'll understand why that's an excitatory action. Okay. And then remember the muscarine receptors. Okay, these are found at the post-ganglionic parasympathetic nervous system. These are found after these post-ganglionic parasympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic neurons. All right, and the actions between these and acetylcholine, remember, are going to be inhibitory or cause a decrease in activity, with the exception of the SNS and sweat glands. Okay, even though that is technically a cholinergic response, cholinergic setup, it does cause increased activity of the sweat glands. Okay. Now, we call these muscarine receptors because of mushroom poison. Okay, basically there are certain mushrooms, I can't remember which ones off the top of my head, that create a poison, which coincidentally is called muscarine. And essentially, what it does is it can bind to these receptors, but it cannot bind to nicotonic receptors. Okay, whereas when you think of nicotine, okay, nicotine can only bind to nicotonic receptors, but not these muscarine receptors. Okay, so remember, nicotine is a chemical as well. All right, so a little naming 101. All right, so the adrenergic receptors. All right, the adrenergic receptors. These are, they're essentially broken down into two classes, alpha and beta, and there are subclasses of these as well. All right, there's alpha 1 and alpha 2. All right, alpha 1 and alpha 2. All right, and these receptors are going to be found in different locations. All right, so alpha 1 receptors essentially are going to be found in vascular smooth muscle. Okay, of skin, skeletal muscle, okay, the splanchnic region. Oops. Okay, sphincters of the GI tract. Oops. Okay, and the radial muscle of the iris. I'm just going to write iris. Okay, but the radial muscle of the iris. Okay, whereas alpha 2 receptors are going to be found in the walls of the GI tract. Okay, they're going to be found in the walls of the GI tract. All right, and then you've got beta 1 and beta 2. Okay, these beta 1 receptors are going to be vascular smooth muscle of skeletal muscle. Okay. Whoa. Oh, they're not. Come on, eraser. We'll omit that. Now, brain and pen are not working in synchrony. Beta 1 receptors are going to be found in the heart. Okay, my apologies on that, folks. They're going to be found in the heart, primarily on the SA node. I was looking at my notes wrong. Sorry about that. The AV node. Okay, and the ventricular myocardium. Or myocardium, heart muscle. Okay, they'll also be found on some salivary glands. Okay, they'll be found on salivary glands. These shall be found in adipose tissue. Now that's an interesting one to think about for a second. And then also within the kidneys. Kidneys, all right. Whereas beta 2 receptors are primarily found, again, vascular, this is where I got my notes mixed up, sorry, smooth muscle of skeletal muscle, so essentially the vessels that supply skeletal muscles. Okay, walls of the GI tract. Okay, the urinary bladder, and this is a big one. Okay, the bronchioles. Okay, the bronchioles. Now this is one of the, now all of this, now sorry I spent a little boring time writing all this, but this is really important to understand. Okay, this is really important to understand. Because if you understand the basics of what we just discussed here, if you understand the basics of all this, okay, the concepts that I've been mentioning so far, you know, acetylcholine, preganglionic excitatory, norepinephrine, postganglionic excitatory. This one little exception here, excitatory. You know, with the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system, preganglionic neurons excitatory, postganglionic neurons inhibitory. That concept of dual innervation that I mentioned. Okay, if you understand the basics of this concept and with these neurotransmitters, okay, then you need, and if you understand where these receptors are located, you'll understand. You'll be an expert at this system. Okay, you'll be an expert at this system. Okay, so think about this. Let's go back to the basics here. The sympathetic nervous system, we said, is designed to increase physiologic activity, okay, to prepare us for stress. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, does the opposite, okay, slows us down, helps us recover from stress. All right, so essentially, so these muscarine receptors, I mean, these are also going to be found in the walls of the GI tract. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. Remember that concept of dual innervation. We just mentioned here that there are some of these, you know, the adrenergic receptors are also found in the walls of the GI tract. All right, so let's think about digesting food. Let's say you eat a meal. Okay, let's say you eat a meal. All right, you eat a nice little meal here, and you need to digest that food. So you go sit down and you hang out. All right, you're sitting there hanging out, you eat that meal, all right, and you know that there's, you know, sympathetic and parasympathetic dual innervation of your GI tract. Which one of these two systems are going to be exerting more control? Now think about it, the parasympathetic nervous system. So what's the parasympathetic nervous system going to do? It's going to promote peristalsis. Okay, it's going to promote peristalsis, the muscular contractions to move the food around. It's going to increase glandular activity. Okay, you're going to produce more gastric and GI secretions. All right, the sympathetic nervous system is going to, you know, the lowered activity, the SNS, is going to cause the sphincters between the stomach, the small intestines, and the colon to become relaxed and open. So you can move this bolus of food that you're digesting between the organs of the GI tract. All right, so it's kind of cool just to think about things like that. It's kind of neat to think about things like that. All right, so understand this. Alpha, beta receptors, muscarine, nicotinic receptors. All right, where these are located. All right, and I know these are listed within your textbooks as well. I'm hoping you guys are having books open while you're reading this, whether it's a physiology book or whichever book it is that you're using for your class. Whether it's, you know, the Marion and Hohen, you know, the book that we use for the class I teach, or any other book. You know, you should always have a book open when you're listening to these. All right, so keep that in mind. Alpha 1, alpha 2. So think about this then. Let's say let's go the opposite, and let's say we're thinking about stress. Okay, let's say you're driving down the highway and a car cuts you off. What happens to your heart rate? Huh, what do you know? The SA node is the pacemaker of your heart. I mean, I haven't gotten into cardiovascular physiology yet, but, you know, but think about this. What do we say the sympathetic nervous system does? Increases activity, right? So if we release norepinephrine, that's going to increase the activity of the pacemaker. That's going to bring your heart rate up. The AV node essentially is designed to slow the conduction process down, but this speeds this up. Increased heart rate. All right, norepinephrine to the myocardium of the ventricles, the main pumps of the heart, that's going to make the heart contract with more force. So what's it going to do to your blood pressure? Bring it up. So you guys are getting the picture. Hopefully, just hearing this is giving you, the picture here. Okay. So again, understand these various organs and the receptors that are found on these organs. Because as we saw in the previous video when we looked at the anatomic differences between these and saw which regions that these went to, like I said, most of the autonomic nervous system dually innervates the body. Now, this is an interesting one here, though, adipose tissue. Okay, adipose tissue. Why fat? Why do we want these receptors on fat? Why do you think that would be? Think about a heightened state of stress. Think about when you're exercising or you're trying to outrun something that's threatening you, or you're just trying to outrun something, cop. Hopefully you're not trying to outrun cops, but or a bear or a mugger or all the above. What's your appetite like? You're not, if I'm out on a long run, sure, I might be thinking about what I want to eat afterwards, but am I really hungry? No. All right. You're not putting food in yourself, so where are you going to get your fuel from? Adipose tissue. All right. So what do you think the sympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate within fat? It's going to stimulate the breakdown of fat, so you can burn those calories for energy. All right. And something to keep in mind though is that norepinephrine does not really work all that well at within adipose cells, but epinephrine does. Okay, epinephrine does. All right. Hence going back to that, innervation of the adrenal medulla. I'll talk more specific to that in a second. Okay, so it's something to keep in mind. So, that's why exercise is an extremely important component of, if you want to lose weight, losing weight. Okay, because that stimulates the direct breakdown of fat. Just make sure you don't pack in more calories than what you tried to burn in the first place. Okay, so essentially what we're saying here is that the sympathetic nervous system keeps the sphincters between the GI tract or between between the urinary bladder contracted. All right, keeps them contracted. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, if this is dominated control, will cause increased activity. Basically contraction of the bladder and opening of these sphincters. Okay, same with the GI tract. Okay, now think about this. What is epinephrine going to do if it interacts with the beta-2 receptors of the bronchioles? Think about this. When you're in a heightened state of stress, what happens to your breath rate? It goes up, right? You're gonna breathe more because you need because your metabolism is going to go dramatically up, and you need to get the heck out of that situation. So your bronchioles are going to dilate. Hence, that's why people carry around EpiPens. Okay, remember the anaphylactic shock, or when people go into allergic when people have a severe allergic reaction. Okay. Histamine is going to stimulate because remember, when people having a severe allergic reaction, they release a lot of histamine, okay, or an asthma attack, or whatever the situation may be, okay, their airways are going to close. But if you carry around an EpiPen, all right, and which epinephrine acts very potently at these beta-2 receptors. So basically, you take the EpiPen, you can't breathe, you take that pen, you jab it in your leg, give yourself a squirt of epinephrine in the bloodstream, and that binds to those receptors. That's going to make your airways open up. That's going to make the muscles of the bronchioles relax and make them dilate, and you'll increase airflow into your lungs, hopefully prevent death or other complications. All right. So I hope this is all coming together as I'm talking about it, okay? Because like I said, this is important, and like I said, it's also relatively easy, all right? You know, as you start to go through this, and it just becomes more second nature to you guys. So let's talk about some specific, physiologic reactions that take place in the body. You know, when these organ systems start to, you know, become stimulated by these divisions, all right? So think about it. I mean, what's going to happen to the eyes, all right? You know, we're talking SNS. What are the pupils going to do? You know, I mean, basically we're talking about the pupils. Okay, the pupils are going to do what? They're going to dilate or constrict. What do you think? What do you think the pupils are going to do? Pupils. Man, I'm sorry, folks, I can't talk today. They're going to dilate. Okay, I mean, think about it. You know, this is a physiologic response to stress. All right, you got to remember, we're essentially animals with these built-in survival mechanisms. All right, we just like to take it a little more advanced and exercise as well. But if you're trying to evade a predator, okay, you're going to want to have the best possible field of vision as you can. Okay, and by dilating your pupils, that's going to allow more light in, get more of the retina active, and hopefully enhance your vision. Okay, and think about this as well. If you see someone pumped up on amphetamines or cocaine or meth, if you want to work in the emergency room, but get used to seeing that, especially if you're working in the bigger metro areas or an area where there's a lot of truck drivers or heck, all the above, you know, that's something you're going to see. All right, because remember, those drugs are what we call stimulants. All right, you know, there's a reason why we call them stimulants. All right, so that's going to cause, you know, dilation of the pupil. That's going to cause blood pressure to go up. It's going to cause increased heart rate, breath rate. There's a reason why those amphetamines do what they do. Okay, because they interact, you know, what do you think they do? They act like sympathetic chemicals. Okay, so whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, well, you can do the math then. Remember that concept of dual innervation, that's going to make the pupils constrict. Okay, so right now, well, think about it. If you turn all the lights off in the room, what are your pupils going to do? If you turn all the lights off, your pupils are going to dilate so you can get more light in. Right now, I'm assuming, hopefully you're sitting there with the lights on. Okay, your pupils are going to be more constricted. And again, back to drugs. Okay, you know, people take heroin. Marker spasm again, sorry. People take heroin, their pupils are going to be rather constricted. Okay. So, again, the dual innervation, but you notice the opposite effects. All right, the GI tract already started hitting on that. Okay, the sympathetic nervous system, you know, if we have increased activity of the sympathetic nervous system, that's going to cause the sphincters to close. All right, that's going to cause the sphincters to close. That's going to decrease muscle activity, so basically decrease peristalsis, and that's also going to decrease glandular activity. All right, and much later on when I make videos, because the GI tract alone has its own little interesting built-in nervous system that we like to call the enteric nervous system, and it's really cool to take a look at, but I'm not going to get into it now. All right, but think about this. You know, you ever hear people say stress can cause an ulcer? Stress can kill you? They're not kidding when they say that. So let's go with the stomach, for example. Let's say you're this, you know, big alpha dog. You know, you're just a person who's just high strung. Everything's got to be highly dramatic. Or you're a soccer mom that's trying to save the world, or, well, heck, all the above. Okay, or a person that if the wind changes directions, you snap. All right. You know, what's going to happen is these, you know, I mean, you know, stress, sorry, when you get all worked up like that, that's stress, right? So that's going to increase sympathetic activity. All right, so let's say you got your stomach here. Actually, your stomach is going to be facing this way. Let's actually try to draw an accurate representation here. All right. So let's say you've got this decreased activity here. All right, let's say you've got a little bit of extra acid. Let's say you got some acid hanging out in the stomach, but not enough mucus. Okay, or, you know, I haven't gotten to this yet, but you know, sympathetic, you know, this increased sympathetic tone is going to cause vasoconstriction to these areas. You know, to areas, you know, like your splanchnic region, you know, like your stomach and your GI tract and so on. So if you're chronically high strung, All right, but these vessels are continuously constricted, probably more than they should be on a regular basis. That let's just go with the stomach that normally supply the stomach. Well, what's going to happen to the tissue of the stomach? It's going to slowly start to become ischemic. All right, it's going to start to slowly become ischemic. And then what does tissue do as it becomes ischemic? It slowly goes away, slowly dies, and then eventually, then if you start losing that tissue, you may lose the mucus barrier that coats that area of the stomach, and the acid may start to eat through it, and you develop an ulcer. And then if that ulcer perforates and you bleed to death, it's going to, well, kill you. So stress can kill. That's why, that's why there are stress management tips and techniques for people out there who have, who live busy lifestyles, who are just high-strung individuals, and so on. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. Whereas a parasympathetic nervous system, as we previously mentioned, is going to do the opposite of all this. Again, dual innervation. It's going to increase peristalsis, increase glandular activity, and and that's going to cause the sympathetic nervous system to lower its activity to this area, and that'll make the sphincters open and allow the passageway of food from point A to point B and C and so on. All right, so the heart. Again, we've already mentioned the heart. Okay, we said that while you're at rest, the vagus nerve, okay, is keeping the pacemaker, i.e. the SA node, at a lower pace. The average, like I say, the average heart rate for people is about 70 to 75 beats per minute at rest. At least that's what it should be. Okay, or lower. That's variable between people, but remember these numbers are averages. Okay. So the vagus nerve is keeping the pacemaker running slower. It's keeping the AV node, it's slowing down the conduction velocity of the cardiac conduction system. The cardiac muscle is not contracting with as much force. But if we increase our SNS tone during a state of stress, that'll have the opposite effects. That'll increase activity at the pacemaker. That'll increase depolarization rates through the AV node. That'll increase the contraction strength of the heart. All right, and that will promote more blood flow and also cause an increase in arterial blood pressure. I.e., bring your blood pressure up. So you guys are probably starting to think about this already. Blood pressure medications. And I'll come to that in a little bit, but keep that in mind. Okay. Now, systemic blood vessels. This is kind of an interesting one. All right, this is kind of an interesting one because systemic blood vessels are only innervated by postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and you want to think that sympathetic neurons, cause vasoconstriction of all blood vessels except the blood vessels in skeletal muscle. Okay, except blood vessels of skeletal muscle. All right. So back to this example I used before. So let's think about this here again. This this idea of a height of the SNS and stress. Okay, the sympathetic nervous system is going to increase your heart rate and so on. All right, but remember, there's a reason why we call a really heightened state of stress fight or flight. Oops. You have two options if you're engaging in this physiologic response. Outrun the stressor or whoever you're with, or fight your way out of the situation. All right, and in order to do that, in order to maximize that, you're going to need to redistribute blood flow to your skeletal muscles. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to cause blood vessels to constrict, to your GI tract and so on. Okay, to your kidneys. All right. And that's going to cause, blood vessels to skeletal muscle to dilate. Okay, it's going to cause dilation of those vessels. So you can see the importance of this. All right. And what's all this going to do to blood pressure? Okay, what's all this going to do to blood pressure? All right, think about this. I mean, if you have an increased heart rate, Okay, if your peripheral resistance, with the exception of your muscles, goes up, when I say peripheral resistance, I mean increased vasoconstriction. Okay, that's going to cause your blood pressure to go up because you're trying to pump the same volume of blood through smaller pipes. You're going to have to work harder to do so. Granted, a huge portion of the circulation of the body is just the skeletal muscles, but still, you get the picture here. We need to increase flow to this area, so that's going to bring blood pressure up. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is going to bring blood pressure back down, hopefully. All right. Because that means that the parasympathetic nervous system is in control. That means the sympathetic tone on the blood vessels is hopefully going to be lower. All right, because normally the sympathetic nervous system keeps blood vessels constricted to about half their normal diameter. All right, but in situations such as stress, that makes them constrict even farther. Again, with the exception of skeletal vascular, or the blood vessels that supply skeletal muscles. Man alive. All right. So if we reopen these blood vessels, all right, that will cause blood pressure to go back down again. You have a very constant volume of blood, and if you're pumping that same volume of blood through now larger pipes, it's not going to require as much pressure to cause the flow of blood, and therefore blood pressure will go down. All right. So it's some stuff to think about here. So think about all this while you're listening to this. And now I want to talk a little bit about the adrenal medulla. All right, just a little bit about the adrenal medulla, because this is essentially important. In really extreme cases of stress. Okay, real extreme cases of stress. All right. Now you can see here that the two, that the two hormones released from the adrenal medulla are either going to be norepinephrine or epinephrine. Well, actually, it's both at the same time. About 80%, remember, is going to be epinephrine, and about 20% norepinephrine. Okay, and epinephrine, we like to say, has a little higher potency just because of how it interacts with some of the other receptors better than norepinephrine. Now, remember, epinephrine is strictly a hormone that is secreted from the adrenal medulla. Norepinephrine can act as both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. It just depends on where this is being released from. If this is being secreted from the adrenal medulla, then we call it a hormone because this is a chemical message being released from a gland. Okay, if it's a chemical message being released from a synaptic terminal of a neuron, then that means that is a neurotransmitter, and the effects are, most of the time the effects between hormones and neurotransmitters are different. In this situation, they're actually quite similar. Okay, they're actually quite similar. All right, now you can see that norepinephrine and epinephrine are essentially the same chemical message with one slight difference. This just has an extra methyl group, okay, an extra functional group. Other than that, they're essentially the same hormone, and the effects are going to be the same. Okay, the effects are going to be the same. Like I said, epinephrine is just a tad more potent. Now why is it important to have this system? Why, because we've been talking about that we've got these sympathetic neurons that just branch out to, practically all tissues of the body. Okay, but not all cells can, not all cells are come in contact with the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. Okay, think about, think about your metabolism here. Your metabolism is regulated. It comes from practically all cells of the body. All right, so think about those adipose cells, fat cells, and so on. Okay, some of your liver cells. All right, there are some effects that epinephrine will stimulate at these areas that norepinephrine can't. Okay, so that's the beauty of being able to utilize the adrenal medulla in a really extreme, type stress situation, because we can release this hormone, epinephrine. All right, this can go into the bloodstream and then diffuse from the bloodstream, all right, and come in contact with more cells than the neurotransmitter can, going directly from a nerve to a specific little population of cells. All right. So like I said, you know, by utilizing the adrenal medulla, this dramatically increases our ability to handle stress. All right. But at the same time, this can also be detrimental to our health if this response is a little too severe or if it sticks around too long. Okay, because you know, one thing, you know, the effects of these hormones being released in the adrenal medulla, all right, this lasts longer than the neurotransmitters do. Okay, than the neurotransmitter epinephrine does. All right, you know, it takes on average about 2 to 4 minutes to clear out adrenal medulla secretions. All right, so as a result, you know, think about this. So let's say blood vessels are constricted for too long. Because remember, you know, these catecholamines, adrenaline, pretty much causes the constriction of blood vessels, with the exception of, again, skeletal smooth muscle. All right. Now, if the blood vessels to my kidneys or my GI tract are constricted for too long, that could do some damage to these organs. You know, if I squirt out a lot of adrenaline and it sticks around for longer than norepinephrine does. All right. You know, if I increase blood flow and the contractile strength of my muscles goes up, you know, during this, you know, because you think about this, you think about adrenaline during these, you know, when people perform these superhuman, you know, feats like flipping a car off of somebody or picking up a fallen large tree off of somebody that you normally need a cherry picker to grab. Or, you guys get the picture here. All right, so yeah, that sounds heroic, but what you don't hear about is all the damage that is done to these people, because our muscles are not designed to contract at full force. I mean, even though they have the potential to, we never utilize that because we'd rip our tendons right off of our bones. All right, or these people may box their kidneys because their kidneys become so severely ischemic for too long. All right, so this is a useful mechanism to really help us in a survival or a really extreme stress type situation. But again, this is not something you want as a prolonged response. All right. And so we would say then that when the sympathetic nervous system engages, that, you know, because of all these hormones that are released, that we would say that this is called mass discharge. We would call that mass discharge. Okay, so when the sympathetic nervous system initiates a response to stress, i.e., heightens their physiology, it does it, you know, massively, you know, by causing the release of, you know, a lot of neurotransmitter all at once, and potentially these hormones if needed. All right. Whereas with the parasympathetic nervous system, you know, due to its anatomy, you know, with the vagus nerve and the more specific innervations that you can see, you know, this, you know, it's going to be the parasympathetic nervous system is a lot more specific and causes localized responses. Okay, versus, because, you know, remember, because I haven't talked about control yet, but I mean, you know, you should be thinking by now the autonomic nervous system is controlled by the brain. Okay, so you're talking, if you want to get the sympathetic nervous system engaged, you're talking brain, spinal cord, and then out throughout the various branches of this nervous system. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, you know, is about 90% cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, with specific branches to tissues. All right, these specific branches are a lot more easily controlled. All right, so that's why you see these systemic effects that occur. So keep that in mind about the adrenal medulla, and just think about the effects that the fight or flight response is going to elicit. I mean, what's going to happen to your pupils? Again, pupillary dilation. What's going to happen to your blood pressure? It's going to go up. All right. What's going to happen to cellular metabolism? It's going to go up. But what's going to happen to your appetite? You know, what does the sympathetic nervous system do to the walls of the GI tract? Remember, we said it tightens the sphincters between the stomach and the intestines, and it also lowers the muscular activity of these areas. So as a result, you're not really going to be eating much. So where are you getting your fuel from then? You know, you're going to have to get your fuel again from those adipose cells or the fat cells. Okay, and that's going to increase the activity of the liver. All right. You know, that's gonna cause, because essentially your muscle strength and your muscle contractions are burning a lot of glucose. You have to get that blood sugar up. You know, one, so your muscles can be fueled, but more importantly, so your brain can be fueled, because those muscles are going to be eating up all that sugar. Your brain needs that fuel. So that's going to cause what's called glycogenolysis. You'll break down glycogen within your muscles. Then it'll cause lipolysis, breakdown of fat. And then it may start to cause what's called gluconeogenesis in the liver, basically making sugar out of other sources, you know, such as fats and amino acids. Okay, and I'll talk more to that later on, but it's just, you know, stuff to think about. All right. So that's the adrenal medulla. And, you know, I've already more or less mentioned this ANS tone, so I'm just going to skip this. But I want to talk about, you know, autonomic control. All right. So essentially, the autonomic control. This is, you know, the brain is what controls the autonomic nervous system. All right. You know, the brain, i.e., the, you know, primarily the hypothalamus. Okay, and the brainstem. Okay, and in doing so, it does this through reflex activity. Okay, because remember, this is remember, we said the autonomic nervous system is the automatic, unconscious. Okay, and you know that unconscious, you know, activity with the nervous system is all reflexive type activity. All right, so essentially, so for example, and again, I'll just give you one brief little example here. You know, let's go with blood pressure. So let's say we've got the heart. You know, we've got the heart, and let's say your blood pressure is going to start to, I don't know, say your blood pressure rises. All right, then you've got these, and then you've got your aorta. All right, and then you've got some carotid arteries. All right, so what may happen then is, let's say your blood pressure goes up. All right, say your blood pressure goes up. So your blood pressure is going to go up, and that's going to stimulate these receptors. We've talked about receptors already, called baroreceptors. Remember, baro means pressure. Okay. And then that will increase rate of, you know, in the carotid arteries and the arch of the aorta, and that'll increase the rate of action potentials to what's called the vasomotor center and the cardiac centers of the brainstem. Okay. And then in turn, what that's going to do is that's going to increase your vagal tone. And remember, what do we remember? Vagus nerve, parasympathetic. And what's that going to do to your heart rate? It's going to decrease your heart rate. All right. And then at the same time, this response is going to continue out to your blood vessels, and that's going to decrease the sympathetic tone on blood vessels and make your blood vessels dilate more. So think about it. If you slow down the pump and you lower the pressure, plus you increase the openings, you know, you increase the diameter of the plumbing, that's going to bring blood pressure down. Okay, and we can sit. I mean, again, I could sit here and list more examples, but again, this is just how the autonomic nervous system is primarily controlled, through these really baseline reflex activities. All right, because I mean, remember, the brainstem, the brainstem pretty much controls the most primitive physiologic activities of the body, you know, because a rule of thumb with the brain, anatomically, the lower you go, the more baseline and primitive the functions of the brain. Whereas the higher you go anatomically, the more advanced the actions of the brain are. And you guys know the hypothalamus. You know, the hypothalamus is essentially for the regulation of our homeostasis. Okay. And the hypothalamus can help us regulate, items such as body temperature, okay, appetite, and so on. All right. And remember, the hypothalamus, there's the hypothalamus, there's a lot of input from the cortex and from other areas of the brain. So the hypothalamus can basically, can react in response to emotional and not just physiologic stress. All right. So due to the due to the activity of the limbic system and the hypothalamus and the cortex and here and so on. All right. So that's something to keep in mind. So essentially, when it comes to control of this, the hypothalamus and the brainstem through reflex activity, and it's not just physiologic stress that can engage the autonomic nervous system. Again, it can be what was I going to say? It can be emotional stress as well. Because think about it. You guys can probably sit here right now, You guys can sit here right now and just think about something that makes you mad or sad, or maybe just this lecture alone is driving you nuts and you're getting sick of listening to me, and your blood pressure is just starting to go up because you're becoming emotionally angry. Okay, that's control coming from the hypothalamus. Okay, that's coming strictly from the hypothalamus and affecting the brainstem, obviously, but you get the picture. All right, you get the picture. And then last but not least, I've actually kind of been hitting this as I've been going, but you have to understand the basic pharmacologic implications of this as well. Because, I mean, we've been talking about, remember those beta-1 receptors, for example. We said that those increase heart rate. Okay, those increase heart rate. So you guys should understand then, I mean, a beta blocker. Okay, so think about it. Remember, we're talking a chemical message type system. A hormone or a neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, norepinephrine plus a beta-1 receptor equals increased heart rate. All right, but let's say this is that beta-1 receptor, and this is normally where norepinephrine binds. If we stick a chemical in there that can bind to this receptor, but still not increase heart rate, that's going to prevent norepinephrine from binding, and that's going to lower essentially heart rate. That's going to lower heart rate. Okay, hence the term beta blocker. Or again, think about the, the EpiPens. Okay, the EpiPens and the beta-2, the bronchioles. Okay, there's a reason why we carry that around, because when epinephrine binds to these bronchioles, that creates a pretty powerful response, i.e. bronchodilation. Gets our airways, going again. All right, and this is also why when it comes to getting people on certain drugs to help help us regulate these responses, that it can be tricky, because there are certain blood pressure medications that can that can bind with both beta-1 and beta-2 receptors and so on. So that's why what are the drugs? Like propanolol and atenolol. That's why there's been a lot of up and down with those drugs. All right, or nicotine and nicotonic receptors. Okay, nicotine is a stimulant. Okay, now to some people who haven't really learned a lot about this material before might think that's a little weird, because I mean, when people, when do a lot of people like to have a smoke? I mean, I bet 99.9% of people that smoke don't plan on becoming addicted to cigarettes. Okay, I mean, no one ever does. You just do it for, you started because I don't know. Some people started because they want to be cool, because it was something to do with your friends. It was something you do at a party, or something people do to take off the edge. Okay, now in the brain. Okay, in the brain within the limbic system, nicotine causes, relaxing type effects. But outside of the brain, out of the periphery, remember, nicotine plus nicotonic receptors, well, what does that equal? That equals excitation, right? So what's that going to do to your blood pressure and so on? Bring it up and so on. Okay, so maybe you're calming yourself in the brain by lighting up, but out in your periphery, you're not. Okay, you're not. In fact, you're stimulating your physiology. That's why they say, if you want, that's why they recommend the patients, and you're going to have to tell this to patients, regardless of what area of medicine you're going into. You're going to run into a lot of patients who are smokers and have high blood pressure. You're going to have to counsel them to, get their smoking down and to eventually quit, or at least, dramatically decrease their nicotine intake. Okay. So that's something to bear in mind. And think about why you would get addicted to nicotine as well. Okay, let's say at these preganglionic neurons, you constantly have nicotine binding to these nicotonic receptors. So you're activating these neurons. Okay, So you're activating those postganglionic neurons. So why in heaven's name, then, would you want to produce more acetylcholine? Why would you waste energy producing acetylcholine if you're already pumping yourself full of nicotine and activating these presynaptic neurons in the first place, right? That's why when people, try to quit smoking, they get really, really edgy. You see some physiologic effects take place, getting jittery and so on, primarily because, the effects of the autonomic nervous system. You have to wait for your nervous system to start producing enough acetylcholine to regulate the activity again. All right. But then after about not long, after about a month and a half, that's even pushing it, saying a month and a half, all right, it gets so hard to stop, to stay off of cigarettes, not because of the physiologic stuff here, it's just because of the psychologic stuff. You're used to sticking your fingers in something else in your mouth, or the oral fixation, or the social aspects of it, or all the above. Okay. So you can kind of have like I said, I've been hitting on this throughout the entire talk. And now, like I said, hopefully this helps you, like I said, understanding the autonomic nervous system and all of this will help you really understand the, what was I going to say? The pharmacologic aspect. So when you actually take a specific pharmacology class, go back to your notes you took on this chapter and on this discussion, and make sure you come back to these, because that's really going to help you understand a lot of pharmacologic aspects. So, as I keep repeating. So if you folks have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I hope this lecture made sense, and take care, folks, and I'll be starting the endocrine system next week, so keep an eye out for those videos. So take care, and again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask away.